Okay, so continuing with the objectives. Okay, so we're going to explain the difference between the rectangular and polar forms of complex numbers, and we're going to convert a complex number from polar to rectangular form and vice versa. Okay. And lastly, we're going to explain how to use complex numbers to solve series and parallel AC circuits containing resistance, capacitance, and inductance. Okay. So, so the complex numbers will play a vital role in the discussion of all the topics in circuits too. Okay. So kaya uh, I suggest you you have a mastery on the complex numbers, especially on the mathematical operations. Okay. Now, so let's talk about the imaginary unit I. So in studying equations, solutions sometimes involve the square roots of a negative number. So actually, there is no square root of a negative number, like the square root of negative 16. We said it is not a real number because there is no real number such that your x squared is equal to negative 16. Di ba? So how if we will have a perfect square, okay? So if we will have a perfect square, we could never have a negative 16. Kahit pa sabihin mo yan negative 4 square, it will give you still positive 16. Okay? So hindi hindi naman po pwede yung 4 times negative 4. Okay? So if this will be the operation, then bibigyan ka nga ng it will have a result of negative 16. But we are talking perfect square. We are talking about square root. Okay? So there is no real, okay? There is no real square root of a negative number. Okay. So to include such roots, dahil wala nga itong the square root of there is no square root of a negative number, so to include such roots in the number system, mathematicians created a new expanded set of numbers called the complex numbers. So the foundation of this new set of numbers is the imaginary unit I. Okay? So the imaginary unit is denoted as the small letter I. Now, let's have this definition. The imaginary unit I is denoted by the letter I, in lowercase I, and is defined as the lowercase I, or the imaginary unit I, is equal to the square root of negative 1. Okay? Wherein okay, I square is equal to negative 1. Okay, so these two are to be uh, are to be remembered. Okay? Was 'di ba parang doon sa trigonometry natin, these are identities, no? These are similar to the identities in trigonometric functions. Okay? So kaya itong the value of I, which is equal to which is equal to the square root of negative 1, and I square is negative 1, should also always be remembered. And these are considered identities. Ibig sabihin hindi laging nandyan siya, no? Okay? So recall that for positive real numbers A and B, we define the principal square root as your B is equal to the square root of A, which means that the square of B square is equal to A. Diba? This is the inverse of square root is squaring. Diba? So similarly, we define the principal square of a negative number as the square root of negative A is equal to I multiplied by the square root of A. Since, okay, since I, okay, is equal to the negative, if since I is equal to the square root of A square, so that will be also equal to, so di ba, Pagka dinistribute natin tong exponent here in the I, magkakaroon tayo ng I square and the square root of A, di ba? The square root of A is also equal to the square A raised to 1/2. Correct? Correct? Good.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Okay. So when you square it, so this will now multiply here. So that will be equal to A. That will be 2 over 2. Diba? So 2 over 2 is equal to A raised to 1, and any number raised to 1 is equal to the number which is equal to A. Okay? So kaya itong A na to, ito na siya. Ito na siya. Okay? And then I multiplied by I is equal to I square. Okay? And from our identities na sinasabi, di ba, I square is equal to negative 1. So this means that I square, that I square A is equal to, I square is equal to negative 1. Okay? So that is negative 1 multiplied by A. And then we will now have, it will now result to a negative A. So ayun na siya. Okay? Ito na siya. Now, if negative A is a negative real number, then the principal square root of negative A is, the square root of negative A, okay, is equal to I multiplied by the square root of A. Okay? Where I is the imaginary unit, and I square is equal to negative 1. Okay? And then we write I square root of A instead of, okay, instead of the square root of A multiplied by I. So to avoid confusion as to what as to what is included in the radical. Okay? Kasi dito sa radical sign, ang included lang dito ay yung A, hindi yung I. So kaya inuuna natin yung I before the radical sign. Okay? Now, so this is a study tip. Okay, so just remember this one, that the square root of negative A is equal to the square root of negative 1 multiplied by the square root of A, and it will give you, and also equal to I square root of A. Okay, now let's have an example here. So using imaginary numbers to simplify radicals. So for example, we have negative 9. Okay, so for the negative 9, di ba? From these identities, okay, so we will now have this one. Okay, oops. So negative 9, okay, is equal to, ito daw, negative A is equal to the negative 1 multiplied by the square root of A. So that will be negative 1 multiplied by the square root of A. And what is A? That is 9. So we will now have negative 1 multiplied by 9. Okay? But we all know that the square root of negative 1, yeah, but, okay, the square root of negative 1, di ba? Sabi natin, the square root of negative 1, okay, ito, the square root of negative 1 is equal to I. Yeah? Or but I is equal to the square root of negative 1. So therefore, itong negative 1 natin would be equal to I multiplied by the square root of A, which is 9. Okay? So kaya tayo nag-arrive dito. So we'll copy I, okay? And then the square root of 9, so 9 is a perfect square. Okay, so the square root of 9 will be equal to 3. So writing that in the standard form, we write first the real number and then the imaginary number, which is I. Okay? So therefore, the square root of negative 9 will be equal to 3i. Okay? So similarly, with the square root of negative 8, again, yeah, again we follow, okay, we follow that, okay, the square root of negative a is equal to the square root of negative 1 multiplied by the square root of a. Okay? So it will now be equal to negative 8 is equal to the square root of negative 1 multiplied by the square root of 8. Okay? So yung 8, okay, para ay, nga pala to, sorry. Okay. So yung 8, okay, para ma-simplify natin, okay, so we could also write that as negative 1 multiplied by 2 square root of 4. Tama? Square root of 2 multiplied by square root of 4. Tama? Di ba?
Po, sir.
Okay. So that will now be the square root of 1 multiplied by square root of 2. Okay. And what is now the square root of 4? What is the square root of 4?
2.
Okay. So we write now, so the square root of 1 from our identities, so this is equal to I. So this is I multiplied by, let's have the 2 there. And then wala naman tayong perfect square root for 2. We could have that square root of 2. Okay? So writing this in the standard form, wherein we write first the real number, which are the 2 square root of 2, and then the imaginary unit I. Okay? So that will now be 2i, sorry. So 2i, okay, multiplied by the square root of 2. Kasi meron pa tayong radical dito eh. So dito natin ilagay para hindi malito yung I na nakapasok doon sa radical side. Okay? So 2i multiplied by square root of 2. Okay? So let's now have the complex number. So what is now a complex number? Okay? Kanina pinag-uusapan lang natin ay imaginary number. Ngayon ang pag-uusapan natin ay yung complex number. Okay. So what is a complex number? In standard form, it is defined as a plus bi. Okay, wherein a is our real number, where a and b are real numbers, and I is the imaginary unit. So we denote a as the real part of the complex number. So itong part na daw to is the real part. Okay. And this part now would be the imaginary part. Okay. So this is the imaginary part of the complex number. Okay. So a complex number is a combination of the real part and the imaginary part. Okay. Ayan. So a complex number is written as a plus bi is said to be in standard form. So ito yung standard form of writing a complex number. So if a is 0 and b is not equal to 0, then the resulting complex number bi is called pure imaginary number. Kasi sabi natin na, di ba, a plus bi. A is 0, di ba? Tapos b is not equal to 0. So if this is 0, so 0 plus bi, so bali wala naman yung 0 dito. So matitira na lang ay bi. So this is now what we call the pure imaginary, okay, imaginary number. Okay? But if B is 0, then, okay, kung B is 0, ito naman ang 0, yung B. Okay? This is our standard form, A plus BI. So if B is 0, okay, the set of all real numbers are the set of all imaginary numbers are both subsets okay, of the set of complex numbers. So kung 0 ito, ang matitira na lang ay yung 8, which is a pure real number. Okay? In this illustration, this is now the complex number in standard form. And the left side are real numbers as long as B is equal to 0. Okay? So, ang magiging sagot lang ay real number as long as B is equal to 0. Okay? So, if A will be 0, then the result will only be the imaginary numbers. Okay? So, in the following examples, okay, these are also complex numbers. So bakit daw sinabi na natin na yung 17 ay complex number? Anyone? Paano natin nasabi na yung 17 daw ay complex number? Anyone? What is the condition? Hello? Hello?
Yung ano
Naririnig?
sir, yung sa real numbers po ba? Ito, yung
Ito. Sabi dito kasi, the following are examples of complex numbers. So, the 17, 2 minus 3i, negative 5 plus I, 3 minus I square root of 11, and negative 9i. Okay? So, yung 17, bakit ito tinawag na complex number? What were the conditions here?
Di po namin alam, sir.
Sir, yung ano po kasi,
Yung
yung imaginary number po kasi, yung B is equal to 0 po, sir.
okay, yes. Your B is equal to 0, 'di ba? So sinasabi dito sa illustration natin, 'di ba? Na ang result daw ay real number lang kung your B is equal to 0. 'Di ba? In a complex number, your left side is the real part and on the right side it is your imaginary part. Okay? So tama ano? So dito kasi ang sinasabi rito, kaya ito daw ay considered as a complex number because B is 0. Di ba? BI, di ba? A plus BI. B is 0. So this whole term is equal to 0. That is A plus 0. So it is only equal to A. So 17. Okay? So 2 minus 3i is a complex number. 2 is the real part and 3i is the imaginary part. Okay? Negative 5 plus I is also a complex number. Negative 5 is the real part. I is the imaginary part. Okay? So 3 minus I square root of 11 is also a complex number. Okay? 3, your 3 is the real part and the I square root of 11 is the imaginary part. Ngayon, sinasabi dito na yung negative 9i daw ay complex number. Paano naging complex number yung 9i?
Sir, kasi po yung A is equal to 0, yung real number.
Yes. Your A is equal to 0. Ito yun, okay? Ito yung concept na yun. So, if A is equal to 0, then it doesn't really matter kung isusulat pa ba natin dito yung 0. Di ba? Ah, so, hindi na natin sinusulat yung 0, kaya it is negative 9i. Okay. Okay. So, next. So, equality of a complex number. So, the complex numbers a plus bi is equal to c plus di are equal if and only if a is equal to c and b is equal to d. Okay? So in other words, two complex numbers are equal if and only if both real parts are equal and both imaginary parts are equal. Okay? So later on, mapapatunayan natin yan when we go to the division, no? To the division operation with regarding complex numbers. Okay? So let's have first the first two operations regarding complex numbers. We're going to talk about the adding and subtracting of complex numbers. Okay. So complex numbers in standard form. So tatandaan nyo lagi pagka sinabing standard form. So that is in the form a plus bi. So are treated in much the same way as binomials of the form a plus bx, di ba? Ito yung binomial natin. Okay? So one is the constant part and one is the one with the variable. So we can add, subtract, and multiply complex numbers the same way we perform these operations in binomials. So you have to remember how you add, subtract, and multiply binomials. Okay? So when adding or subtracting complex numbers, you combine real parts with real parts and combine imaginary parts with imaginary parts. Okay? Kumbaga sa kanta ng pambata, pag samasamahin ang pare-parehas. Okay? So, let's start with this example. Okay? So let's start with 3 minus 2i, okay, plus negative 1 plus I. Okay? So let's write the equations. We have the quantity 3 minus 2i plus quantity minus 1 plus I. Okay? And then first step is to eliminate the parentheses. Okay? So from this, naging ganito na. Okay? So we eliminate the parentheses for the 3 minus 2i and the parentheses from negative 1 and I. Okay? So, sabi, group the real and imaginary numbers respectively. So, let's start with the real part. So, the real parts are 3 and 1. So, igrupo natin sila, pagsamahin natin. So, that is now in a quantity 3 minus 1. And then, let's now group the imaginary numbers. So, the imaginary numbers are the negative 2i and the positive I. So, negative 2i plus I. So, i-group na natin siya. And then, we perform the ordinary addition and subtraction. So, that is 3 minus 1. We have 2. And then, negative 2i plus I. Okay? So, merong imaginary 1 yan dyan, di ba? So, negative 2i minus 1i. So, it will now give you negative 1i or that is negative I. Okay? So, negative I, plus naman yon. So, they have different symbols. Okay? So, it will now be equal to negative I. So, combining them, it will now be 2 minus I, wherein 2 is the real part, okay, and I is the imaginary part. Okay, so 2I is still written in the standard form A plus BI. Okay? So A plus BI, so we have 2 minus I. Okay? So this is now the real part, and this is now the imaginary part. Okay? So how about negative 2i minus 3 minus 4i? Again, let's write the equations. So we have 2 minus I minus 3 minus 4i. Okay? And then let's eliminate the parentheses and distribute the negative sign. So dahil meron tayong negative sign in between the two quantities. Okay? So ni-remove natin ito, parenthesis ng 2 minus I, kaya meron na tayong 2 minus I. Tapos dahil may negative tayo dito, i-distribute natin ito dito. At i-distribute natin ito dito. Okay? So negative times positive 3. So that is negative 3. And then negative multiplied by negative 4i. So negative, negative. So that will now be positive 4i. Okay? Tapos sabi, group the real and imaginary numbers respectively. So the real parts here are 2 and 3. And the imaginary parts are negative I and positive 4i. Okay, so grupo na natin. So that is 2 minus 3. Okay, plus, okay, kasi di ba, plus muna yung gitna kasi ito yung standard form, A plus BI. Hindi naman sinabi na
Kahit,
A minus BI.
kahit po minus, gagawin plus.
Oo, plus muna for the meantime. So depende kung ano ang magiging sign noong result nitong imaginary part. Okay? So plus muna siya, no? So we now have negative I plus 4i. So it will now give you 3i. Positive 3i dahil mas malaki yung 4i sa negative i. Okay? So writing this, so 2 minus 3, so we'll now have negative 1. And then we'll now have positive 3i. So negative 1 plus 3i will be the result.
Sir, paano po pag negative yung 3 ay magiging negative po yan or positive ba din po?
Depende, no? Depende nga sa tag dito sa result ng grupo ng imaginary part. So, katulad nitong unang example natin, nung ginrupo natin to, di ba? So that is 3 minus 1 plus, okay? Okay? Plus yung imaginary part. So we have 2i, di ba? Plus i. So plus pa rin to. Pero noong tag dito nung i-conduct na natin yung mathematical operation, so 3 minus 1 is positive 2, okay? And then negative 2i plus I is equal to negative I. Di ba? Ganyan siya. So plus. Plus minus to, ay minus yung result nito, edi magiging minus to. Kaya the final result is 2 minus I.
Okay po sir, thank you po.
Okay.
Naintindihan ko na sir.
Yes, yes, yes. Okay. Now, how about multiplying complex numbers? Again, let's follow the operations using binomials. So when we multiply binomials, nagdi-distribute tayo, di ba? Okay, we use the distributive property of multiplication. So for example, we multiply the quantity 5 minus I by 3 by the quantity 3 minus 4i. Okay? So, let's use the multiply, okay? Multiply using the distributive property. So that means na itong 5 na to, okay? 5 will now be multiplied to 3 and it will also be multiplied to 4i. Okay? And then this negative I will be multiplied also to 3 and also be multiplied to negative 4i. Di ba? So, ganyan yung distributive property. So, kaya, so we have 5 multiplied by 3, ito siya, and then 5 multiplied by, 5 multiplied by negative 4i. Then
Sa FOIL
next,
method po yan, sir, di ba?
yes, the FOIL method din yan. Okay? Parehas yan. Okay? So, next we have, di ba, we have I. Okay? So, we have negative I multiplied by 3. So, ito siya. And then negative I multiplied by negative 4i. Di ba? Right? I multiplied by negative 4i. Okay. So, na-distribute na natin. Ano? Then, let's do the operation. Okay. So, that is 5 multiplied by 3 is 15. 5 multiplied by negative 4i is negative 20i. Positive, negative. So, negative. And then,
Ano yung isang I doon, sir?
ha?
Yung isang I, negative I, wala yun.
Saan? Di ba ito siya? Di ba 5 and 3, ito. 5 and 3. Tapos 5 and negative 4i. Ito. Di ba? 5 and negative 4i. 5 and negative 4i. So 5 multiplied by negative 4i is 20i. Tapos negative I multiplied by 3. Negative I multiplied by 3 is equal to negative 3i. Okay? And then negative I multiplied by negative 4i. So negative, negative, positive. So meron tong imaginary 1. 1 multiplied by 4 is 4. And then I multiplied by I. Okay? I multiplied by I is equal to I square. Kuha? Kuha?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Kuha po.
Yes po.
Okay. So, meron tayong previous identity, di ba? Na yung I squared daw ay equal to negative 1. Okay? Kuha? So, meron
Opo,
tayong
sir.
So, meron tayong I square dito. So, itong I square na to, papalitan natin ng negative 1. Okay? So, that will leave us, so 15, 20i, 3i. So, dati, positive 4, di ba? Dati, positive 4i square. Since I square is negative 1, so that will now be 4 multiplied by negative 1. So, bibigyan na lang tayo ng negative 4. Okay? So, with the previous discussion on addition and subtraction of complex numbers, pagsamasamahin daw yung pare-parehas or pagsamahin yung real part, okay? The 15 and 4 and the imaginary part, which are the negative 20i and negative 3i. Okay? So that is, di ba, 15 minus 4, okay, plus, okay, negative 20i minus 3i. Okay? So 15 minus 4 is 11. Negative 20i minus negative 3i is negative 23i. So negative, tapos ito ay positive, magkaiba sila ng sign. So it will now be negative. Okay? Nakasunod?
Yes po, sir. Nakasunod po.
Okay. So madali lang naman yan. Okay. So again, when multiplying complex numbers, you have to remember that I square is equal to negative 1. Okay, so let's have some other examples here. So let's multiply the quantity 3 minus I by the quantity 2 plus I. Okay, so multiply daw natin ito. Again, let's use the distributive property. Okay, so yung FOIL method, so that is 3 times 2 and then 3 times I. Okay, ito yun. 3 times 2 and then 3 times I. And then negative I multiplied by 2, negative I, okay, negative I multiplied by 2, okay? And then negative I multiplied by positive I. Okay, so negative I multiplied by positive I. Okay, so we'll now have 3 times 2 is 6, 3 times I is 3I, negative I multiplied by 2 is negative 2I, negative I multiplied by I is minus I squared. Okay, but we all know that I squared is equal to negative 1. So rewriting this, so we have 6, 3I, negative 2I minus, and then I square is negative 1, minus minus, that will now be plus. It will give us positive 1. So let's group the terms to, okay, so let's group the terms to perform the addition and subtraction of complex numbers. So that is 6 plus 1 plus, okay, 3i, okay, 3i, and minus 2i. Okay, so this is 6 plus 1 is 7, and then plus 3i minus 2i, that is I. Okay, so when we multiply these two terms, it will give us 7 plus I. Okay, is it clear?
Sir,
Okay, so
Clear po,
lastly, okay, so lastly we have I. Okay, I multiplied by the quantity negative 3 plus I. Okay, ito siya. So so distribute natin yung I, we have negative 3I, and then I multiplied by positive I is equal to I squared. Okay, so wala na tayong masyadong problema with 3I, and then I squared is equal to negative 1. So it will now be written as negative 3I minus 1. Okay? Or writing it in standard form, let's start first with the real part, which is negative 1, and then followed by the imaginary part, which is negative 3I. Okay? Any question?
And so far, sir.
Okay. So how about dividing complex numbers? Okay, so dividing complex numbers. So magkakaroon na tayo dito ng tinatawag na conjugate. Okay? So recall the special product that produces a difference of two squares sa ating mga binomials, wherein we have a plus b multiplied by the quantity a minus b will give us a square minus b square. Okay? So this is one property in the multiplication of binomials. Okay. So this special product has only first and last terms because the outer and inner terms cancels out. So nagzi-zero. So similarly, if we multiply complex numbers in the same manner, so the result is a real number because the imaginary terms cancel each other out. Okay? So the product of a complex number, which is equal to z, is equal to a plus bi, and its complex conjugate is z prime, okay, or z bar is equal to a minus bi, is a real number. So when we combine the original complex number with its conjugate, we are actually when we multiply them, okay, nagka-cancel out yung inner part at saka yung outer part. Kaya ang natitira lang ay yung real part. Okay? So in order to write a quotient of complex numbers in standard form a plus bi, we multiply the numerator and the denominator by the complex conjugate. So ano ba yung complex conjugate ng denominator? Okay? We will see later on. So it is important to note that if I is present in the denominator, then the complex number is not in standard form. Okay? Now, let's have the let's have the terms 2 minus I divided by 1 plus 3I. Again, so we multiply the numerator and the denominator by the complex conjugate of the denominator. So dito sa equation na to, okay, so this is our numerator and this is our denominator. When we say complex conjugate of the denominator, itong sign nila sa gitna, binabago natin. Kung positive to, gagawin natin negative. Kung negative naman yan, gagawin natin positive. Okay? So, therefore, the complex conjugate of 1 plus 3i, the complex conjugate of 1 plus 3i is equal to 1 minus 3i. Sundan nyo?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So, this is the original equation. So, this is now the original equation. Okay. We are dividing these terms. Okay. And then we multiply it. We multiply it by the complex conjugate of the denominator. So, this is the denominator, 1 plus 3i. And this is its conjugate, 1 minus 3i. Okay? And then, we multiply the numerators and the denominators. Ito, imumultiply natin dito. Ito, imumultiply natin dito. Also, using the distributive property. Okay? So, sa denominator, makikita nyo na parehas yung terms natin, 1 plus 3i, yung 1, 3i, 1, 3i, magkaiba lang sila sa sign sa gitna. Okay? So, ito yung sinasabi kanina na special products na ang nagiging result lang ay a square minus b square. Or it is equal to the real part only. Okay? So, let's do this. Use the FOIL method or the distributive. So, that is 2 times 1 is 2. And then 2 times negative 3i is negative 6i. And then we now have negative I multiplied by 1 is negative I. And then negative I multiplied by negative 3i is positive 3i squared. Okay? Nakuha niya?
Oh, sir.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
Ay, sorry. Negative 3i multiply, positive 3i multiplied by, okay, tama. Negative I multiplied by negative 3i is positive 3i squared. So, sa denominator naman, okay, so 1 multiplied by 1 is 1. And then 1 multiplied by negative 3i is negative 3i. Okay? And then next, we have 3i multiplied by positive 1. So that is positive 3i. And then positive 3i multiplied by negative 3i, that is negative 9i squared. Okay, so to continue, okay, so let's simplify. Let's combine the imaginary parts and the real parts. So for the numerator, we are combining what? Okay. So ito, no? So 3i square. So mababago pa to because I square is equal to -1. Tama?
Yes po,
Tama?
sir.
Tapos -6i and -i is 7i. Ito. Tapos dito sa denominator, 3i, -3i plus +3i, 0 na yan. Okay, ang matitira na lang is 1 minus 9i square. But 9i square, I square is -1. Okay? So dito we have 2, okay? 2, 7i. Ito yung 7i natin, -7i. And then 2 times, 2 plus 3, -1. Di ba? So that will now be equal to -3. Tapos yung denominator natin, so I square is -1. And then negative naman ito. Okay? So that is positive 9. Okay? It will give us positive 9. So rewriting this, okay? So we now have 2 minus 3 is -1. And then 9 multiplied by -1 is -9. So -9, negative. So magiging positive. So that is 1 plus 9. That is 10. Okay. And then to write it in standard form, okay, so that will now be -1 over 10, okay, minus 7 over 10i. So this will now be the result in standard form. Nakasunod ba?
Opo, sir.
Okay.
Parang pinahaba lang po, sir, di ba?
Oo, konti lang naman yan. Pero actually, meron yan sa calculators niya eh. This is the longhand. Pero pagka yan, na-encode nyo na sa calculators niya, dire-diretso na yan. Simple yan, ang bilis niyan. So, tinuturo ko lang sa inyo to kung if ever now, hindi nyo dala yung calculator or hindi nyo kabisado yung calculator niya. Okay? So, I suggest you study your calculators para hindi na kayo dumadaan sa ganito kahaba na proseso. At
Sir,
least,
pag sa calculator, sir, yan lang po yung ilalagay, yung i-input.
yes, the real part and the imaginary part. Lalo na yung yung mga calculators na may matrix. Meron ba sa inyo nun? May nakakapag-drawing ng ng waveform. Tapos dito pwede rin mag-solve ng ng matrix. Kahit inverse matrix, pwede. May calculator sa inyo ganon? Wala.
Wala.
Pero guys, doon
Bawal
sa
yung
dito, pagka kukuha kayo ng board exam, merong merong lang required na calculator. So pagka mas modern doon sa calculator din, hindi yun tinatanggap. Yung mga kayang mag-drawing ng waveform, yung nakakapag-compute ng matrix, hindi yun pinapayagan sa board exam. So you could check the memorandum from the Philippine Regulation Commission or Regulatory Commission. So dito, meron lang doon pinapayagan na brand at model ng calculator. So other than that, hindi po pwede. So pagka mag-take kayo ng board exam at nakita ganun yung calculator nyo, wala doon sa listahan nila, you cannot take the board exam. Pauwiin ka kagad. sabihin nandadaya ka na agad. Okay? So next. So raising complex numbers to integer powers. Okay? So hindi lang integer ang dito, ang na-rearrange natin into powers, even the complex number. Okay? So let's note that your I is equal to the square root of negative 1. And I square is equal to negative 1. Okay? For example, we have I cube. Yeah? I cube is also equal to I square. Okay? So pagka in-expand natin yung I cube, it is also equal to I square multiplied by I. Okay? But we all know that I square is equal to negative 1. So therefore, I cube is equal to negative 1 multiplied by I, is that will be equal to simply negative I. Okay? And then I raised to 4 is also equal to I square times I square. Diba? But we all know that I square is negative 1. This is negative 1. And so that is negative 1 multiplied by negative 1. So I raised to 4 is simply equal to 1. Okay? Nakuha nyo?
Sir. Medyo, ano lang. Nalilito lang konti. Pero gets naman po.
Sir?
Yes. Okay. So how about the equivalent? So what is I raised to 5? Yeah. So I raised to 5 is also equal to I raised to 4 multiplied by I. But from our previous discussion, that I raised to 4 is simply equal to 1. So that is 1 multiplied by I. So I raised to 5 is simply equal to I. Okay? So how about I raised to 6? Okay? So I raised to 6 is equal to I raised to 4 multiplied by I squared. So we know that I raised to 4 is equal to 1 and I raised to 2 is equal to negative 1. So we multiply 1 by negative 1. So I raised to 6 is simply equal to negative 1. Okay? So even though we have I raised to 7, so I raised to 7 is also equal to I raised to 4 multiplied by I raised to 3. So I raised to 4 is positive 1 and I raised to 3 is negative I. Diba? So we multiply it, 1 multiplied by negative I. So I raised to 7 is simply negative I. Okay? So how about I raised to 8? Okay? So I raised to 8 can also be written as I raised to 4 raised to 2. Okay? But we all know that I raised to 4 is equal to 1. Okay? So this is 1. Then 1 square, 1 multiplied by 1 is equal to 1. Okay? So that is now how you raise complex numbers to integer. Okay? So we have here some examples. So nagawa na natin to kanina. I raised to 7. I raised to 7 is I raised to 4 multiplied by I raised to 3. So I raised to 4 is 1. I raised to 3 is negative I. So we multiply it. 1 multiplied by negative I is negative I. How about negative I raised to 13? I raised to 13 is also equal to I raised to 12 multiplied by I. And that is I raised to 12 is also equal to I raised to 4 raised to 3. Okay? Then multiplied by I. So I raised to 4 is 1. Okay? So that is 1. Then raised to 3, that is 1. Okay? Multiplied by I. So it is simply I. So how about I raised to 100? Okay? So I raised to 100 is equal to I raised to 4 multiplied by I raised to 4 raised to 25. Okay? So we all know that I raised to 4 is 1. Then any number multiplied, di ba? So 1 raised to any number pala. So 1 raised to any number is always equal to 1. Okay? Question? Question?
Ano po, sir?
None.
naman po, sir.
Yes. So raising a complex number to an integer power. So we have here 2 minus I cube. Okay, the quantity 2 minus I cube. So paano natin gagawin ito? Okay? So recall the formula for cubing a binomial. Okay, wherein a minus b cube, the quantity a minus b raised to 3 is equal to a cube minus 3a square b plus 3ab square minus b cube. Okay? And then we let a to be 2. Ito yung a. And then let b to be our I. Okay? So this is our formula. Okay? So A is 2, B is I. Okay? So let's follow this. A cube is 2 cube. So that is 3A square B. So that is 3, 2 square B is equal to I. Okay? And then 3AB squared. So the 3, this is A. And then this is B squared. And then minus B cube, minus I cube. Okay? So let's simplify one at a time. So 2 cube, we have negative 3 times 2 square multiplied by I. Tapos, this I square is equal to negative 1. Diba? I cube is equal to negative I. Okay? So that will now be 3, 2 multiplied by negative 1 minus, okay, minus, pakopay muna natin yan, minus negative I. And then, let's perform the operations. So 2 cube is 8. This is negative 3 square, okay, I. So 2 square is 4. Multiplied by 3 is 12, I. So negative. And then 3 times 2 is 6 times negative 1. Okay. Minus negative times negative 1 is negative 6. And then negative I, that is positive I. And then let's combine the real parts and the imaginary parts. So we have 8 minus 6, we have 2. And then negative 12i plus I is equal to negative 11. Okay, So that is how you raise a complex number to an integer power. Question? Any question?
Wala naman po, sir.
Wala naman. Okay, so very good. So in summary, so we now you have to remember these things, okay? So that I is equal to the square root of -1 and I square is equal to -1. The standard form for a complex number would be I plus bi. Okay, where a is the real part and b is the imaginary part. Okay, and then when adding and subtracting complex numbers, okay, we combine the real parts and the imaginary parts respectively. For multiplying complex numbers, we do the FOIL method, and but remembering that I square is equal to -1. And in dividing complex numbers, okay, so we make use of the complex conjugate. Okay, so the complex conjugate is simply the inverse of the original equation. So kung plus ito, negative yung conjugate niya. Kung ito ay negative, positive yung kanyang conjugate. Okay? So, how do we apply these complex numbers in AC circuits? Okay. So, complex numbers refer to a numerical system that includes the phase angle of a quantity with its magnitude. Okay. So, therefore, complex numbers are useful in AC circuits when the reactance XL or XC makes it necessary to consider the phase angle. So for instance, the complex notation explains why Z is negative with XC and I is negative with IL. Okay? So by the way, okay, XL is inductive, okay, is inductive reactance, and it is measured in ohms. XL is capacitive reactance, and also measured in ohms. Okay? So to compute for XL, so XL is equal to 2 pi, which are the constant, and the frequency multiplied by the inductance L. For XC, so XC or the capacitive reactance is equal to 1 all over 2 pi, the frequency multiplied by the capacitance. Okay? So Z is what we call the impedance. So impedance is similar to the resistance in DC. Okay? So impedance siya pagka AC ang pinag-uusapan natin. Resistance siya pagka DC ang pinag-uusapan natin. Okay? So any type of AC circuit can be analyzed with complex numbers, so they are easily convenient for solving series parallel circuits that both resistance and reactance in one or more branches. So although graphical analysis with phasor arrows can be used, so the method of complex numbers is probably the best way to analyze AC circuits with its series parallel impedance. So you can analyze this using graphical analysis by using vector analysis. Okay, but it is much more easier if we're going to analyze AC circuits with the use of just simply computation. Okay. So these are the positive and negative numbers in complex numbers. So our common use of numbers as either positive or negative represents only two special cases. So in their more general form, numbers have both quantity and phase angle. So we have the directions here. Okay, so we have the 0 direction here, 0-degree direction, and we have the 180-degree direction. Okay, and okay, and how we measure the phase angle would be from the 0-degree direction to the 180-degree direction. Okay, or from the 180 direction, okay, towards the 360-degree direction. Okay. So for examples, the numbers 2, 4, 6 represents units along the horizontal x-axis. So we have the 2, 4, and 6. So extending toward the right along the line of 0 phase angle. So ito siya. So if the units are in the x-axis and going to the right, okay, so our phase angle would be equal to 0. Okay, so therefore positive numbers represents units having the phase angle of 0 degrees, or this phase angle corresponds to the factor of 1. Okay, so later on we will know bakit naging factor of 1. Okay, so to indicate 6 units with 0 phase angle, then 6 is multiplied by 1 as a factor for the positive number 6. So the positive sign is often omitted as it is assumed unless indicated otherwise. Okay? So po pwede naman natin isulat na ito ay 2 lang, 4, ito ay 6 lang. So without the positive signs. So alam naman natin na kapag sinulat natin yung any integer without the sign, okay? Without the sign, alam naman natin na it is a positive number. Okay? So in the opposite direction, negative numbers correspond to the 180 degrees, or this phase angle corresponds to a factor of negative 1. Okay? Now, so actually the negative 6 represents the same quantity as 6. Okay? 6 nga din siya, but rotated through the phase angle of 180 degrees. Okay? Parehas din siya no, tag dito nung positive, no? Okay, yun nga lang yung positive numbers, okay, ang phase angle niya, okay, ang phase angle niya ay 0 degrees, while negative numbers, okay, have a phase angle of 180 degrees. And the operator for negative 1 is 180 degrees. The operator for positive 1 is 0 degrees. Okay. Now, let's talk about the J operator. Okay. The J operator is similar to the imaginary unit I. So kaya lang natin hindi ginagamit yung I sa analysis of AC circuits kasi baka mapagkamalan daw yung I ay current. Okay? Kaya imbis na small I yung ginagamit natin, in the analysis of AC circuits, ang ginagamit natin ay J. Okay? So yung I equal also to J. Okay? So the operator for a number can be any angle between 0 degrees and 360 degrees. So since the angle 90 is important in AC circuits, the factor J is used to indicate that it is in 90 degrees. Okay? So this will now be your J axis. Okay? Kahit pa pumunta yan dun sa baba, okay? Your horizontal line is your real axis and the vertical line or the J, okay, or the J is your imaginary axis. Okay? So tandaan niyo yan, ha? Yung horizontal is real and the vertical is imaginary. Okay. So let's move further. So gagamitin natin yung J na instead of I. Okay. So paano naging yung ating 0 degrees ay positive 1 at yung ating at yung ating 180 degrees ay naging negative 1. Okay? So remember that the horizontal is your real axis and the vertical is your J axis or the imaginary part. Okay? So okay. So the reason is that the J sign is 90 degrees operator just as the positive sign is 0 degree operator and the negative sign is 180 degrees operator. So any quantity at right angles to the 0 axis or 90 degrees counterclockwise, okay, is on the J axis. So lahat ito na, okay, so lahat itong part na to is in the J axis. Basta papunta siyang counter. Okay. So in mathematics, numbers on the horizontal axis are real numbers including positive and negative numbers. So numbers on the J-axis are called imaginary numbers because they are not on the real axis. In mathematics, the abbreviation I is used to indicate imaginary numbers, while in electricity, however, J is used to avoid confusion with I as the symbol for current. Okay? And then furthermore, there is nothing imaginary about electrical quantities in the J-axis. Okay? So sabi dito na an electric shock from J 500 volts is just as dangerous as 500 volts positive or negative. Okay? So sinasabi lang na this is the imaginary. Okay? So more features of the J operator are shown here. Okay? So we have sinasabi natin from 0 to 90 degrees, that is positive J. Okay? And another 90 degrees would be equal to J square. Di ba? Sabi natin kanina, di ba, yung I is also equal to J. So therefore, okay, I square is also equal to J square. And we all know, okay, we all know that I square is equal to negative 1. So therefore, J square is also equal to negative 1. So kaya 180 degrees is equal to J square is equal to negative 1. Okay. Tapos, another 90 degrees daw ay another J. Okay. So if this is J square, that will now be multiplied by another J. Okay. So J square times J would be equal to J cube. Di ba? So, we all know from our previous discussion that I cube is equal to negative I. So therefore, if I is equal to J, then I cube is equal to J cube. So that will now be equal to, So that will now be equal to negative j. Okay? Kaya this will now be negative j. Okay? And then another ikot pa, another 90 degrees is another j. So j cubed multiplied by j is equal to j raised to 4. We all know that j raised to 4 is equal to positive 1. So kaya ito ay naging positive 1. Okay? Is it clear?
Yes.
Can you follow?
Yes po, sir.
Okay. So that is the secret of the J, no? So definition of complex number in AC circuits. So usually the real number is written first. So as an example, okay, the 3 plus J4 is a complex number where 3 is the real part and J4 is the imaginary part. Okay? And then complex numbers must be added as phasors. Okay. So tatandaan niya yan, ha? Phasors. Okay, so how do we add phasors? So phasors are so these are the typical examples of phasors wherein pagka nag-add ka, okay? So we have 3 plus J4 wherein 3 cannot be added with J4 directly because 3 is the real part and J4 is the imaginary part. So how do we do that? So we do the vector analysis wherein 3 would be in the 3 would be in the real part. So 3 units in the real axis, di ba? Yung ating horizontal, yun yung ating real. Okay? Real axis. While yung ating vertical naman would be the imaginary axis. So when we do vector or when we do phasors, we actually do the addition by having the head to tail concept of phasors. Yeah. So this means that 3 plus J4 is equal to 3 units to the right dahil positive siya. And then dahil positive yung J4 natin, so that will now be 4 units up. So 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay. So 4 units up. And then from this, okay, you draw the connecting line from the tail of the real part to the head of the imaginary part. Okay? So parang ito na yung hypotenuse. So you have 3 plus J4 and this will now be the resultant. Okay? So this is now the resultant which is equal to your impedance. Okay? So how about 3 minus J4? So sinasabi lang in phasor analysis that we have 3 units present in the real axis. So we have 3 units in the real axis and then we have, since this is negative J4, so we have 4 units going down because the J4 is negative. So 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay. And then we combine, okay, we join them by head to tail. Okay, so this is head, tail, okay. So and then joining them with a imaginary line, which will now be your resultant, okay, or your impedance Z. Any question? Question? Wala naman?
Sir, palagi pong... okay. Gets na po.
Okay. Tapos na ba kayo ng vector analysis? Ginamit din natin to sa sa physics 2. Ewan ko natatandaan nyo pa. So this is how we add phasors. Okay? Any question so far? So that is how you write it in or you analyze it in graphical. Okay? So this is graphical analysis. And when we apply it to AC circuits, ganito itsura niya. Okay? So we have the real part, which is the resistor itself. And then we have the reactance also with reactance. If it is inductive, okay, it is XL, X sub L. So if it's capacitive reactance, then it is X sub C. Okay? And then pansinin nyo din na yung ating impedance Z, pagka siya ay inductive reactance, it is plus. Okay? Pero kapag capacitive reactance yung kasama natin, okay, ang sign niya is negative. Okay? So XL and XC are measured in ohms, and also our resistances are also measured in ohms. So therefore, our impedance Z is also measured in ohms. Do you get it? Do you get it?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so tandaan niyo yan, ha. Okay. So we'll stop from here. Okay, so please have some additional readings dahil medyo mahaba ito. It is composed of 105 slides. So I think you have to read more of this, no? So para makapag-practice na din kayo. Okay, so anyway, it is available already in our Canvas. So pwede nyo na siyang i-access doon. Okay? Any questions so far? Guys?
Wala naman po, sir.
Okay. So let me just get your attendance. Kasi baka magkaroon na ka ng information overload. Tama ba? Or nakakasunod naman?
Nakakasunod naman.
Or gusto niyang ituloy pa? Gusto niyo pandagdagan? Ayaw na niyo tumagot. Okay, so let's take the attendance na lang. Crisel,
Present po.
Carlos,
Present po, sir.
Patrick,
Present po, sir.
Adrian,
Present po, sir.
Clint,
Present po, sir.
Ramil,
Present po.
John Maury,
Present po, sir.
Rob, Limbo,
Present po.
Jean, Bernard,
Present po, sir.
Brennan,
Present po, sir.
Michael,
Present, sir.
John Micah,
Present, sir.
Leonard,
Present, sir.
Rina,
Present po.
Stephanie, Mike, Lawrence,
Present, sir.
and Russell.
Present, sir.
Okay. So,
Sir, di
that
mo po
will-
ata ako natawag sa
sino?
Gutierrez po.
Gutierrez. Tinawag kita. Ito, present ka nga eh.
Ay, sorry sir.
Uh, okay. So, that will be all for tonight. So, I will not be holding you much longer. So, good night, guys. And please, again, please have some advanced reading. Okay? Kaya lagi ko sinasabi sa inyo na the second sem is very, very short. Okay? So, very, very short and marami tayong dapat pag-usapan because everything in circuits 1 and 2 are included in the board exam. Okay? So, that will be all for tonight. Good night, guys.
Thank you,
po,
sir.
sir.